Right, so good morning, or should I say good evening to people who are joining from the States. So welcome to our today's session on the quantitative history webinar. So today, again, it's our really great pleasure to have Professor Erik Wang to give us a talk on his new research, The Twilight of the Medieval Chinese Aristocracy, Keju, Officeholding, and Assortative Mating in the Tang Dynasty. So let me again just briefly introduce Erik Wang to everybody here. So Erik is an assistant professor in the Wilf Family Department of Politics at the New York University, and his research interests cover comparative politics, historical political economy, China's state building, and research method. And in 2022, Erik received the Mankiw Olson Award for the best dissertation in political economy. And joining us today also is Javier Cha, who is an assistant professor of digital humanities in the Department of History at the University of Hong Kong. And Javier is a digital historian and medievalist who specialized in the intellectual and cultural history of East Asia. So today, Javier will be joining us as a discussion, and later on will give his comment to Erik's paper. And also we have our familiar face here, Professor Zhu Chen, who is our director of the Center for Quantitative History, and also our chair of the Institute of Hong Kong Humanity. Right, so as usual, if you have any questions regarding the talk, please do leave your questions in the Q&A part, and later on, after the presentation, I will deliver these messages to our speaker, and who will respond to your questions. And other than that, so other than that, please do enjoy the talk today. And I will now just hand over the stage to Erik.
Okay, let me share screen. Okay, good. Can everyone see it? Can everyone see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming, everyone, and thank you very much to Professor Zhu Chen for the invitation, and to Professor Javier Cha for agreeing to discuss this research. Today, I'm going to talk about the twilight of the medieval Chinese aristocracy, Keju, office holding, and assortative mating in the town. This talk is based on several pieces of research. One is my article in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with Fang Qiwen and Michael Hout, social mobility in the Tang Dynasty as the Imperial Examination rose and aristocratic family pedigree declined. Another one is my book manuscript under advanced contract with Cambridge University Press. This is with Claire Young, the political economy of China's Imperial Examination system. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to discuss several very, very preliminary results from a new project, again, with Fang Qiwen and Michael Hout, assortative mating in China's Tang Dynasty. And the key takeaway from this talk is that the medieval Chinese aristocracy in the Tang Dynasty was both politically in decline and socially prestigious. There have been growing interest from empirical political economy over the past decade in Keju, China's Imperial Examination system, which builds a very nice connection with the institutionalist approach to political economy. So this line of research, the main argument is that Keju enhanced rulers' power against the elites. But most works in this genre focus on the second millennium, when Keju had already matured, right? So what was Keju's role in political access and social mobility during its nascent stage, aka the Tang Dynasty from the early 7th to early 10th centuries? Tang Dynasty is the first dynasty when Keju became institutionalized, and the last dynasty where the so-called medieval Chinese aristocrats were still thought to hold influence. Right. So these two features jointly make it a very interesting and intriguing question to study the role of Keju in political selection in an era where family background or at least perceived by certain historians to matter, right? And from a sociologist side, right, there is a literature on the role of education in social mobility. Generally, scholars find that there is an effect of education's credential, but most studies are using data from modern settings, so it's hard to tell whether it's an education effect or the effect is conflated with other processes of modernity, such as industrialization and market, right? So here we focus on a decidedly pre-modern age, the medieval Chinese Tang Dynasty, that could help us separate the impact of education credential from industrialization or modernization that did not exist at the time, right? There's also a motivation from a historical literature, a motivation that is heavier for me at least, right? So for decades, historians have been debating the fate of medieval Chinese aristocracy in the Tang Dynasty. We have several classic works arguing that the aristocracy had been in chronic decline since the early Tang Dynasty, right? Most famously by Chen Yinque, right? On the other hand, several historians across generations, which I would refer to as the persistent school, argue that actually aristocratic advantage persisted throughout the Tang Dynasty until it was physically eliminated at the very at the very end of the dynasty by a massive peasant rebellion and the civil war that followed suit, right? So the question is, was the aristocracy already in some kind of decline before this very chaotic and traumatic period that saw its physical elimination, right? So the rise of Keju was key to this debate. So in this talk, I'm going to highlight several problems with the persistent school. Mainly is what statisticians call survivorship bias, or what social scientists will call selection on the dependent variable. Specifically, the two quantities that these historians from this persistent school focus on, which is the proportion of high office holders who are aristocrats and the proportion of those who pass the Keju who are aristocrats. These two conditional probabilities are problematic quantities for the study of social mobility, and I'm going to tell you why. And by focusing on these conditional probabilities, it actually will lead to an overestimation of aristocratic advantage in political careers. And another problem is that there's no statistical modeling of the data, which has recently become very fine-grained data, and there's no control variables, no standard errors, no t-test, right? And this actually leads to an underestimation of the role of Keju, the significance of Keju in the Tang Dynasty. Another problem, which I will also talk about in the talk, is that the operationalization of aristocracy by the persistent school actually mixes up two fundamentally important dimensions, yet different dimensions of family background in medieval China. One is pedigree, one is power or patronage, right? So if we adequately analyze epitaph data with statistical models, the answer is actually pretty clear, right? Aristocracy was already in chronic decline since early Tang, with meritocracy on the gradual rise. So until the introduction of the Imperial Examination system, the Keju, Chinese dynasties had employed several other methods of recruitment. All of them are thought to be heavily related to family pedigree or patronage, right? So one is the commission recommendation, the Chaju, and another is the pedigree-based allocation via the 9-rank gratifying system, 九品中正制, and another one was allocation based on father and grandfather positions, the yin system, which scholars of Korea will also know a lot, right? So the idea behind the Keju was that candidacy for bureaucracy was going to be determined by competitive examinations. It was very briefly introduced in the Sui dynasty, but the Keju in the Sui dynasty was not real, right? Because the access to exam was only open to those nominated by high-rank officials. So it's not really that different in terms of political access from the Chaju system, for example, right? But it was expanded to most adult males in 622 CE, the 5th year of the Tang Dynasty, and it became rapidly institutionalized and developed throughout the dynasty. and it became fully matured in the dynasty afterwards. So how did the medieval Chinese aristocracy fare in an era of Keju exams? So there are many problems with existing research using quantitative data to study this question, right? So problematic claim 1. Aristocratic advantage persisted because the proportion of top officials who were aristocrats remained similarly high from early Tang to the end of the Tang, right? So this is a claim made by the persistent school consisting of several historians across generations, and judging across their work, this percentage is basically 70%. So 70% in early Tang, 70% in late Tang. And with that, they conclude that aristocratic advantage in careers persisted, right? So the basic methodology is that they collect family background info for the very top officials, usually the chief ministers, the zaixiang in the Tang dynasty, because the dynastic histories contain very detailed information for the very, very top officials, right? And then they compute the proportion of chief ministers who were aristocrats by time period, showing that this proportion, around 70%, actually persisted across time periods. So, and for those who study statistics or social science, one could immediately see the problem. What statisticians will call a survivorship bias, what social scientists will call a selection on the dependent variable, right? So this is essentially the probability of being an aristocrat conditional on holding high office. However, actually, aristocratic advantage is the probability of holding high office given that you are an aristocrat minus probability of holding high office given that you are not an aristocrat. Or if we measure career outcomes continuously, it will be the E of office rank given that you are aristocrats minus the E of office rank given that you are not aristocrat, right? So this is quite intuitive, right? So if you want to calculate the premium of graduating from Hong Kong U, from HKU in Hong Kong over graduating from other universities, you want to compute the proportion of HKU graduates who actually get good jobs, and then compute the proportion of graduates from other Hong Kong university in Hong Kong who also get good jobs and take the difference, right? That way you can tell aspiring high school students about the career advantage they will enjoy from HKU over others, right, when they are making school decisions, right? So in other words, we know that P of B given A is not the same as P of A given B, let alone P of A given B minus P of B given A given not B, right? So the problem of conflating the two conditional probabilities when manifested substantively, one of the problems is that by merely calculating the proportion of chief ministers who were aristocrats over time, these scholars do not take into account the differential fertility of aristocrats vis-a-vis the rest of the society, right? So if the persistent school was really correct that there is such a powerful group called aristocrats who took 70% of the top jobs in the beginning of the town, right? Then this group must have tremendous amount of economic and political resources. And we know that in pre-modern history, differential fertility was usually in favor of the rich and powerful, meaning that these aristocrats would have survival advantage over others, and meaning that like the probability of having a son survived from aristocratic family is going to be much higher than that for other families, right? So with only, if we assume only a 25% survival advantage of the lineage, then the ratio between the total number of aristocrats and the total number of other people would have increased 5 times from early Tang to 900 CE across 8 generations, right? And if we assume 100% advantage, this ratio, the relative growth of aristocrats demographically, is going to increase 255 times. We get such big numbers because population simply expands exponentially, right? So in reality, this number is probably too high, but 5 times is very likely within the normal range, right? So if if we look at any existing genealogies of some of the medieval aristocratic clans, we could see that there's a big family tree growing and growing across generations, right? So every generation is much larger than the previous one because of the survival of multiple sons and multiply, right? So you really do get a big demographic increase, and the rest of the Tang society, the commoners, they did not increase as much, or they didn't even barely increase from early Tang to late Tang, despite some kind of increase in the early 8th century, right? So when a group, right, when the size of a group dramatically increase by so many orders of magnitude, while the percentage of jobs it takes remain the same throughout all this time, it basically means that the relative advantage of the group members in taking those jobs over other people has dramatically decreased over time, right? Again, so I am not saying that by their metrics, there's no aristocratic advantage at the end of the Tang, because after all, even at the end of the Tang, aristocrats remain a minority and therefore overrepresented in the top jobs of Tang bureaucracy. However, that extent of overrepresentation must have decreased substantially over time if you trust their numbers and with some very credible assumptions from basic demographic principles, right? So essentially, the message here is that just by using this conditional probability, we actually learn very little about social mobility, or we actually learn the opposite conclusion to the one they want us to believe, right? So this probability, this conditional probability, this quantity remaining the same over time actually belies remarkable social mobility, right? Okay, so the availability of new data has allowed us to avoid the selection on the dependent variable, especially data from epitaphs. A lot of them have been cataloged in the works of Nicholas Tackett at Berkeley University. So one key advantage of epitaph data is that it's a much more representative sample of elite society. Within each province, the excavation of epitaph is seen as a randomly as a roughly random process. So Tackett's book has made a very strong case for this, and this is also the value of epitaphic sample is also sort of appreciated by Chinese historians. So here I'm going to give a shout out to Jiang Aihua, who uses epitaphic data to study demography in the Tang, particularly for the reason of it being a very good and a much more representative sample than sample from dynasty histories, which suffer a lot of selection biases, right? So this sample has rich variation in both family background and career outcomes because it has both winners and losers and both lowborn and aristocrats among the elites, right? So I am talking about lowborn elites versus aristocratic elites here, right? So people who couldn't even read and write, like the very, very poor peasants, are not going to be in the epitaphic sample. So it is an elite sample, but the elite sample actually has a lot of rich variation in family background, right? So what one should do with the epitaph data is that with this sample, you can simply calculate this quantity, right? You can simply calculate the quantity to estimate actual aristocratic advantage, or you can calculate this quantity, right? Or better yet, you could just regress career outcomes on aristocratic family background, which will automatically give you an estimation of these quantities with additional benefits of having control variables and also having variables like the Keju, right? So that's what one should do with these kind of data, right? Focusing on the epitaph only, right? But that's actually not how it was used in Tackett's works, right? So Tackett's main contribution is a data-driven definition of aristocracy, right? So previously, researchers defined aristocracy based on chronym-surname combination. Chronym means a place of origin that elites in medieval China sometimes claim to have come from. And this, and at several points in time, some places of origins produced notable figures in Chinese history. So there were going to be some places of origin, some chrononyms that will be seen as prominent or prestigious, right? And so researchers define aristocracy based on chronym surname combination, or they could predefine aristocracy using father and grandpa office ranks, right? So if you are from a family that hold high offices, you are considered aristocracy. So once they define aristocracy, then they go ahead to calculate this conditional probability, right? The proportion of high office holders who are defined as aristocrats. So this is the persistence school before Tackett, right? But the problem with this is that aristocracy in medieval China was subjective, right? So in the beginning of this talk, I didn't define aristocracy. So usually when a researcher studies something, she needs to define it in the beginning of the research we're defining, or we're defining in the beginning of the talk. Please accept my apologies for not doing that, because there are actually good reasons for not defining it so earlier on, because the definition is part of the problem, right? So medieval aristocracy was actually a subjective concept. It's basically what society at the time perceived to be prestigious. So there's always a question about whether this researcher-imposed definition of aristocracy actually match the perceived reality at the time, right? This is coupled with the very thorny problem that in the Tang Dynasty, lower elites systematically fabricated chrononyms to pretend to be aristocrats in some sorts, right? So this is a consensus from historians of medieval China, the very best of them, right? So what Tackett does is that, okay, I'm not going to predefine aristocracy, because who am I to know, right? But I'm going to let the data tell me what aristocracy really looked like, right? So what the Tang elite society actually perceived to be the most prestigious at the time, right? So he went ahead and constructed marriage networks and their geography using biographic data of 40,000 elites, 14.3% of which came from epitaphs, the rest from dynastic histories. So as I said, epitaph is just a sample. It's not the universe of epitaphs, because only a minority of epitaphs have been unearthed yet. So like every year, there are going to be some epitaphs that got unearthed due to like various archaeological or real estate development reasons. So far, the epitaph sample we get is only a tip of iceberg. So and it does not consist of the majority of the existing biographical data, but even if it's just a small proportion, it's very important because it has very detailed marriage information, which will help you construct marriage networks. And the genealogy information of the epitaph can help you link to the biographic information in dynastic histories. That's how you can construct the big networks, right? So Tackett basically found that if he put everything together, everyone together, and then uses software to construct network, you could actually get like a big network. So I'm gonna just use the word big network from now on, but in technical term, it's basically the giant component, right? For those of network analysis, you know, right? There's a big network of intermarrying families that seem to persist for 300 years. And this network was had always been located in the twin capitals of the Tang, Chang'an and Luoyang, right? And there are two other features of this network that Tackett talks about. One is that most families in this network claim to have come from a prominent ancestry, and some of the families produce who produce office holders across generations. So it's not like in every generation, every son who hold office. It's basically every generation there's one or more than one son who could hold office. So some of the families in the networks are like that. So based on these features, Tackett concluded that, okay, this is probably what aristocracy, what the most sort of prestigious elite looked like in the Tang history at the time, right? So another feature is that actually new families joined this network over time, which created problems. And I'm going to talk about those problems later, right? So elite belonging to this network is defined as an aristocrat in Tackett's framework. So Tackett also has a broader definition, which is anyone who's buried in the capital corridor of Chang'an and Luoyang will be regarded as an aristocrat. So I'm not going to talk about the broader definition today. Okay, so once each person is identified as an aristocrat or not, one could just examine the effect of family background on career outcomes using epitaphic data, right? Because epitaphic data is, as Tackett himself made the case for, much less contaminated by the kind of selection bias issues than food data, which rely on dynastic histories that's basically only select on the most famous ones and the top officials, right? So you could just, so when you have a measure of family background, you should just regress career outcomes on family background using the kind of sample that's the least prone to selection bias, right? But that's actually not what he did, right? So instead, these works actually ended up resorting to the same old method of calculating the probability of aristocrat conditional on being a chief minister as done since the 70s, right? So because the epitaphs for the majority of the chief ministers have not been excavated yet, right? Calculating this quantity no longer uses or needs epitaphic data. You can just, so what Tackett did, as what these folks before him did, was just to go to the dynastic history and get these folks' biographies. So one could effectively say that the most critical evidence for aristocratic persistence in this new lines of works claiming to use epitaph data actually does not really rely on epitaphic data and selects on the dependent variable as before, right? Okay, so there's an additional problem with this definitional framework, right? I've already said this quantity itself is problematic for the study of social mobility. But even if we use this quantity, right, the definition of aristocrat in Tackett's framework actually makes it even more problematic because it's tautological. And I'm going to show you why, right? So in Tackett's framework, anyone who married into the network would have all of their ancestors defined as network members, even when their ancestors were lowborn and never had those marriages before, right? So this essentially misidentifies many rags to riches examples as aristocrats, right? So when a lowborn with Keju and later career success marry the daughter of aristocrats already in this network, then both he and his parents will be automatically defined by Tackett's algorithm as having always belonged to the network, hence as aristocrats, right? So you cannot really study the effect of aristocratic family background on career success when you automatically define people who has career success, therefore more likely to be married into this network, as having aristocratic background, right? So that's tautological. And once I revise the algorithm so that a person is considered aristocrat, having come from aristocratic family, only when his parents were already part of this giant component of networks due to marriages in their construction or above, then I actually find that if you just slightly recode the algorithm to only to restrict to prior generations, not including their own generation, actually it turns out that there is a 25.41% false positive rate for chief ministers coded as having come from aristocratic families in Tackett 2020, right? So these false positives included many prominent examples of social mobility in Tang history. A lot of low-born, like famous ones, Zhang Jiuling, Zhang Yue, Miao Jinqing, Niu Sengru, and so many, and the list goes on, were misidentified as having blue blood by this original network-based definition. Okay, so problematic claim 2. Keju in the Tang was not important because the majority of those who passed the Keju were aristocrats. So for anyone in the audience, if you are ever mildly interested in the question of Keju in the Tang, I'm sure you must have heard of this claim before, right? Keju didn't matter because the majority of those who passed the Keju were aristocrats themselves, right? So this claim is not even wrong, right? I cannot even say it's wrong because as you can tell, it's not even wrong, right? So this is because complete rosters of those who pass Keju in the Tang simply do not exist, right? So government rosters of the Keju list does not exist, right? So calculation of this quantity, the proportion of those who pass the Keju who are aristocrats, therefore uses very severely incomplete list compiled from multiple sources, most of which rely on dynastic histories, right? So we know for a fact that there are more than 7,000 Jinshi in the Tang. Jinshi is basically refers to those who pass them one of the most difficult tests in the examination system, right? So we know the number, right? That's more than 7,000. Guess what? Only 37.13% of the names are ever known to us, right? And detailed family background information that will allow you to define aristocrats is available for an even tinier portion of the grand total, right? So famously, Sun Guodong, so Sun 1980, calculated this proportion, right? The proportion of Jinshi who are aristocrats. But the denominator he uses is only 300. So he only collected data for 300 Jinshi and calculated this proportion, while the grand total is like 7,000. So he only uses 4.16% of the grand total. And by the way, so Kong 2022 actually misinterprets Sun 1980 by saying that Sun 1980 calculates from more than 6,000 Jinshi and concludes that 80% of them were aristocrats. Actually, that's not true, right? Because Sun 1980, if I actually go into the citation, he only calculates this proportion from 300 Jinshi, which is 4% of the grand total, and the percentage is not even 80% as reported by Kong. It's like 76%, right? So the problem with this is that this is severe missing data and missing not at random, right? In such an era when family background info is so unlikely to be to survive over millennia, right? If you only calculate the proportion of Jinshi who has some family background info from such a small proportion of a grand total, you end up having upward bias towards aristocratic dominance because only prestigious family backgrounds in such an era were likely recorded in history, right? So in dynastic histories, right, biographies of top officials are automatically accompanied by the Keju info of their offspring, right? And some scholars like Sun and Mao and Wang Wei, right, define aristocrats as offspring of top officials. So there are Jinshi on this very small list who actually didn't have much success in their political career. They were like much less successful than their fathers, but so their identity as Jinshi were only known to us simply because they were the offspring of very top officials who made it to dynastic histories, right? So there are many Jinshi in the Tang Dynasty who came from a very humble family background, and they passed the Keju. They had career success that essentially beat the odds, right? So they were much more successful in their career than their fathers, right? So they are the prominent examples of they should have been the examples of social mobility, right? So for example, there are a lot of low-born 进士 who later took offices of rank 6 or even rank 5, which are actually very impressive in such a competitive bureaucracy, but that alone wouldn't land them into dynastic histories, right? Because dynastic histories only select on the most famous or the most notorious officials, right? So, and because their father were even worse, right? None of these 进士 were ever known to us, right? If not for the excavation of epitaphs. As I said, epitaph is a much more random sample of elite society that contain both aristocratic elites and low-born elites. So those 进士 from non-aristocratic families were only known, became more and more such 进士 became known to us because of the excavation of epitaphs, right? So what about matching surnames with recorded choronyms, right? So if you don't have good family background information, you at least have the surname of the folks, right? And then you can match them with recorded choronyms, right? So that's what Khan did, right? In his research, but he could only do that with like fewer than 2,000 people, I think, right? Because at most you get like 2,700 names that are ever known to you. That's already only 37% of the grand total, right? So this number is what I collected by myself because I took the most effort to really try to know as many names of 进士 collect as many names of 进士 as possible. Earlier works such as Sun only collected like 300 names, and a lot of these names came from dynastic histories, which have a lot of biases because only children of top officials, even though their children did not do very well in themselves, right? Examples of downward mobility, right? Only children, most 进士 in these names were there because they were children of top officials. And if you define it that way, that's tautological. So if you match surname with recorded choronyms, that doesn't really give you a lot because even the highest limit is already much less than the grand total, right? And the problem with this additional problem with this approach is that there's widespread fabrication of choronyms in the Tang Dynasty, and also aristocrats had already long ago moved from their purported choronyms to the capitals. So choronyms actually no longer carry the meaning of important identity markers in the Tang Dynasty, right? Okay, so if you actually only use epitaphic data, right, which suffer much less selection bias, it turns out that this quantity is 22% to 38%, depending on how you define aristocrats, right? So if you use a sample that's actually less biased by selection issues, you actually end up with a much lower proportion of 进士 who were aristocrats, much lower than these estimates. Okay. All right, so the prior materials have been quite dense. Let's time out and talk about football, right? So why do I talk about football? Well, because we have been watching the Euros, right? So I missed the Germany game because I had to wake up for this talk, right? So in football, there's a very interesting event that actually lend us some insights to study social mobility, right? So in 2009, right, Cristiano Ronaldo left Manchester United to join Real Madrid, right? And by his transfer to Real Madrid in 2009, what is Real Madrid like? What was Real Madrid like? Real Madrid is a team that by 2009 had failed to reach the quarterfinals of the European Champions League for 5 consecutive years, right? Meanwhile, the team that he left, Man United, were actually had actually been champions of Europe and runners-up in 2 consecutive years, right? So in terms of recent performance, Man United was a much stronger team than Real Madrid. So why did Cristiano Ronaldo leave a stronger team to join a weaker team, right? Scholars of medieval Chinese aristocracy would know the answer, right? This is because Real Madrid got the prominent history behind it, right? So by 2009, in Real Madrid history, they had already won 9 Champions League titles, and Man United was not even near that, right? So here we have a case when the ancestral prominence actually dominated recent performance when it comes to players' decisions, right? It's the pedigree itself that matter more than recent success. And people in medieval China were also making Cristiano Ronaldo decisions, right? So here is a conversation between 2 elites contending for the grand ratifier of Yanzhou in the northern Qi dynasty, a little before the Tang, right? So Mr. B emphasizes his the family success in recent generations. So this is what he said to his competitor, right? My family has held the position of provincial governor for generations, and your family has long been our subordinates. Mr. Yang replies, emphasizing the ancestral prominence of his family. Since your ancestor Bigui was executed in 249 CE, your family has produced no notable figures. Recently, the positions of provincial governor have been given to those who distinguished themselves on the battlefield, which is hardly worth mentioning. How can it compare to my family, who served as prefect of Henan and grand tutor during the Han and Jin dynasties, with a reputation for virtue and scholarly conduct that has been praised for generations? So this conversation shows that even the elites at the time couldn't necessarily determine which dimension of family background, whether it's power or pedigree, that should or could influence career outcomes more. So at the end of the day, this position went to the one with ancestral prominence, not the one with the recent success, right? Okay, so a more famous anecdote is Emperor Tang Taizong in early 7th century complaining that the Eastern aristocratic families of Shuilu Li Zheng have not attained great offices for generations. They still call themselves gentlemen, often demanding money and gifts in matters of marriage. Though their competence is mediocre, they still carry themselves with arrogance, selling status to associate with the wealthy and powerful. I don't understand why people still hold them in such high regard, right? So this is a prominent example where the one with the most power, right, with the most power and patronage, with the highest recent success in family history, an emperor, right, complained that ancestral prominence seemed to still matter despite downturn in recent generations, right? So the question is really, when you have ancestral prominence, when you have that pedigree, despite recent downturn in your family fortunes, will that pedigree still give you a career advantage in your generation, right? And to these elites, this is an empirical question that could be examined and addressed by modern methods, right? And the consensus among historians of medieval China is indeed that there were actually 2 dimensions of family background. One is the power of your father and grandfather, right? The recent family success. Another is pedigree of the bloodline itself, right? So to give another intuitive example, let's say an academia, like a PhD candidate goes on the job market, right? So his job market their job market paper is basically the Keju credential, right? And then their advisor's letter will be the father and grandfather offices in this case. So the question is, conditional on their advisors' letters and their job market paper, does the pedigree of the PhD granting institution itself still matter, right? So like I said, not just in medieval times, even today, right? The multiple dimensions of background are important, are interesting, and it's an empirical question. What kind of effects they have separately on career outcomes, right? So the persistent school has been actually heavily criticized by other scholars because their operationalization of aristocracy, and because they only do these simple tabulations, as I show you, they could not distinguish between the two dimensions and separate out the effects of these two dimensions. So Song Chen's book review of Tackett alluded to that aspect a little bit, and Han Sheng at Fudan University actually made a severe critique of Mao Hanguang, mainly on this aspect, the failure to separate these two dimensions. Okay, so in our approach, we're just going to use epitaph sample only, because that is, as Tackett himself has made a strong case, much less prone to selection bias than dynastic histories, right? And we're going to measure Keju, and we're going to measure the first dimension of family background by father and grandfather offices, and we're going to measure pedigree of the bloodline itself, and we're just going to put everything, measure everything, and put everything together in a multivariate regression framework, as scholars of social mobility have done since 1967. Okay, so I have been talking about epitaphic data all day. So this is what an epitaph looks like as a data point. So in Du Zhongliang's epitaph, we could clearly see detailed information about the chrononym, the surname, and also the name, the father and grandfather offices, and the name of the father and grandfather, the detailed career history, and the age and timing of death, right? So we take, after cleaning 3,640 males from the Tackett database, publicized in 2020, which already contains, in addition to person names, the name of the last office taken by the epitaphee, and the names of the highest offices taken by the epitaphee's father and grandpa. Importantly, this database does not contain the text, the actual text of epitaph, but it does provide information that could help me to actually locate the text in various other online portals or in various other libraries or museums. These information actually help me construct our measures. So we operationalize aristocracy by tracing branches and their chrononym surname combinations, right? So the idea is that chrononyms are usually fraudulent and forged in Tang Dynasty, but the specific branches within chrononym surname are actually hard to make up, right? And we have a variable called prominent branch that operationalizes whether you come from aristocratic background. So this is basically the second dimension of family background, which is the pedigree of the bloodline, the ancestral pedigree of the bloodline itself, right? So this variable takes one if the epitaphy can be credibly traced to a prominent branch as highlighted in this 11th century genealogy, okay? So if not, then the variable could still take one if he can be credibly traced to a pre-Tang ancestor mentioned in this genealogy that belonged to a chrononym that was highlighted in an 8th century essay on aristocracy, right? So I make this additional sort of if criteria because there are cases where the chrononym itself simply did not use branches to distinguish members. So there's no way to look for the words of branches, right? So for example, the famous Langya Wangshi, they didn't use the word branch. So for these chrononyms, I still so if these choronyms are nonetheless mentioned in this famous essay on unimportant aristocratic clans, then I will treat that as aristocrat too, right? But importantly, what I did is that I make sure that these epitaphs had to be credibly traced to prominent pre-Tang ancestors in these genealogies, generation by generation, right? So I had to do a lot of cross-checking across sources to reduce measurement errors, right? So if someone in 9th century simply claimed to come from a prominent branch, but it turned out that there's no way to find his great-grandpa or great-great-grandpa in these genealogies, including in other epitaphs unearthed from 7th or 8th century, then this guy will not be regarded as aristocratic, right? So Taki database actually does not contain the epitaph text itself. So I actually had to use the bibliography information to actually go to the text itself at various locations to do the cross-checking, right? So it turns out that 80.1% of the epitaphs claim to have a choronym, which shows you why choronym is no longer a meaningful identity marker, because anyone can claim to have come from a prominent family, where although in fact most of them are not, right? But only 24.5% of the epitaphs had the variable taking 1 in our operationalization. Only 24.5% were credibly prominent, right? And as validation, this measure, our measure of aristocracy, is highly correlated with Taki's network-based definition. The correlation is about like 75%. So this means that they were indeed considered to be socially prestigious, right? So this means that they are, even though this network-based definition has all these issues when studying social mobility, still Taki's contribution is to give us a very accurate description of what the top elites look like in Tang society. And our a priori definition measure actually correlated very well with this. So we actually indeed capture the hottest targets and the most successful suitors in the Tang elite society marriage market, right? So by using our sort of a priori definition, right? Okay, and then for each epitaphy, we're gonna code the Keju information. So I initially did this, try to do this by matching the names on the epitaph with all of those incomplete lists of those who passed the Keju, but as I said, those lists were problematic. This data collection process actually led me to end up just reading the actual text of everything in the Taki database. Again, this database actually doesn't contain the text. I had to, actually go to different locations to get those texts, so that the epitaph text will actually tell you whether the guy passed the Keju or not. And 13.7% of individuals in our data set had Keju credential, right? And we then use office dictionaries from Dynasty histories and a 9th century encyclopedia Tongdian to get the numeric ranks of the last office taken in the epitaph's career and the numeric ranks of the highest offices taken by his father and grandpa. Again, Taki's database does not have the rank of these offices, and I had to consult multiple office dictionaries to actually code the ranks, so we can quantify the career outcomes. And it's actually a difficult process because a lot of epitaphs use like non-standardized way of describing offices, so it took a lot of effort. And in my other work with Clear Young in the book manuscript, we also focus on the nature and types of offices. Okay, so the specification is basically a horse race one. In our main matrix, we included whether you passed the Keju, whether you had the pedigree, which is how we define aristocracy, coming from a prominent branch, and we control for, and we also have father office rank, grandpa office rank, and we also control for whether you belong to this marriage network, even though it's highly endogenous, it's a Takis definition. And we include the linear term and the quadratic term of the birth decades of the epitaphy, so that we can check all of so that we can examine the effects of all of these variables on career outcomes and how these effects vary over time throughout the Tang Dynasty. Importantly, we included very stringent fixed effects. So we interact the province, a modern province of excavation fixed effect by birth decades and geopolitical groups fixed effect by birth decades. I can talk about geopolitical groups in the Q&A. So this is the main result, right? So on the left panel, we show that the effect of pedigree, of ancestral pedigree coming from a prominent branch, which is really a measure of aristocracy by pedigree, started out in for the cohorts that were active in early Tang Dynasty as very important. This is about 2 formal ranks in the 9-rank system. So if you are if you come from an aristocratic family in early Tang, you will end up reaching an office that's 2 formal ranks higher than others on average, right? But this effect rapidly shrank, and it became 0 for the cohorts whose political coming of age coincided with the ascendancy of Empress Wu Zetian, right? And in the later half of Tang Dynasty, it's basically a null effect, right? So essentially, family pedigree matter initially, but it no longer matter over time, right? And the middle panel shows the effect of Keju credential, right? And it's the opposite trend. In early Tang, right, Keju actually didn't really matter, but then the effect became positively significant again for the cohorts whose political coming of age coincided with the rise of Empress Wu Zetian, which is consistent with classic works that argue that there is a chronic decline of medieval Chinese aristocracy with the rise of Keju, and this effect continued to grow and grow and grow until later Tang, right? And then the effect of father's rank on son office rank is always important, but the effects seem to be constant over time. So basically, father matter in the Tang as in other eras in world history and today, right? Okay, so now the question is, so this is basically the effect of Keju controlling for everything. But what if we ask ourselves whether someone from a low-born family, right, could actually transcend his family background to reach a high office or like some offices, right, by attaining Keju credential, right? So could you really help the less privileged, right? So this is what sociologists call the equalizing effect of education credential. So we use standard practices by sociologists to study these questions. We essentially examine the separate effect of family background among those who had Keju credential and versus those who had not Keju, who didn't have Keju credential, right? So here, on the left panel, we show that for those who did not pass the Keju, right, father office rank actually matter for their career. And over time, the effect of father office rank actually seemed to even increase towards the later half of the throughout the later half of the Tang Dynasty, right? So this means for those who didn't pass the Keju, family background matter a lot, right? But for those who did pass the Keju, it seems that the father effect, at least in terms of continuous office rank variable measures, is largely a null, right? So this means that conditional on having passed the Keju, right, a family background no longer to matter a lot, right? So this basically demonstrates the equalizing effect of Keju credential in the Tang Dynasty. Okay, so let me use finally 3 to 5 minutes actually to talk about assortative mating, right? So in medieval China, tomb epitaphs for couples were usually buried together. This is a picture I took from a museum in Henan, which show the epitaphs of the guy from a famous Lu of Fanyang and a wife from the famous clan Cui of Qinghe buried together underneath this very cute turtle, right? So we are interested in homogamy among aristocrats. So this is the effect of having come from a prominent branch on marrying a wife from a prominent branch. So we are still using the male data set. So this picture shows you that there is a homogamy among aristocrats, right? But the coefficient doesn't seem to change over time from early Tang Dynasty to mid to late Tang. Right? So what about the effect of Keju credential on marrying an aristocratic wife, right? So on the left panel, it seems that if you are not an aristocrat, right, then passing the Keju or not does not really help you, does not really make a difference in terms of your probability of marrying someone from aristocratic families. But if you are already from an aristocratic family, then passing the Keju will actually help you a bit. We'll have an additional, we'll give you some additional help to marry another aristocratic family, right? This is early Tang. But in the latter half of the Tang, we see that the complementarity effect of aristocracy and meritocracy actually became more pronounced, right? So if you are from an aristocratic family, you could, and then you also have Keju, then you will have a very high probability of marrying with another member from another aristocratic family, right? So it seems that the complementarity between status and between pedigree and meritocracy seem to increase a little bit in the latter half of the Tang Dynasty, right? So what if we look at homogamy between families with high office ranks, right? So this is not about pedigree alone. This is really about power. So if so do people from powerful families tend to marry other people from other powerful families, right? So on the left panel, the x-axis is father's office rank, and the it is someone's father office rank, and the y-axis is his father-in-law's office rank. So for the ease of interpretation, we recategorize the numeric variable into categorical one to reflect the Chinese coding, right? And let's focus the red line first. The red line is flat here, meaning that if you are already an aristocrat in early Tang Dynasty, then the correlation between your father's office rank and your father-in-law's office rank is basically zero, right? So there's essentially like there's no complementarity for homogamy between families with high office ranks if aristocracy comes into play. But if you do not come from an aristocratic family, then what do you do if you want to marry someone from a powerful family, right? Then you got to have a very good father. You got to have a father who is ranked very high, and that will increase your chance of marrying into another family with high father office ranks, right? It seems that in later half of the Tang Dynasty, this line is even positive for aristocratic families, right? So even if you are an aristocrat, if you want to marry into a family with high office ranks, right? Then you also need to have a good father, right? Coming from like having good ancestors alone could help you a bit, but conditional on having good ancestors, having good fathers will also help you, get with powerful families. And so basically, you could sell status for power in early Tang, and in later Tang, you could sell status for power a little bit, but it would be great if you can also have power, right? So for non-aristocratic people, it looks like the correlation between office ranks, father office rank and father-in-law office ranks is even more important than before, right? So this means that in latter half of the Tang Dynasty, if you do not have credibly great ancestors and you still want to marry with a wife from a powerful family, then you have to have powerful fathers, right? Okay, so these are really preliminary results, and we are still working on more robustness checks and having a richer set of results. Okay, in conclusion, what do we make of the Tang Dynasty? Politically, Tang Dynasty was an era of what I call demedievalization, right? Decline of aristocracy in terms of pedigree itself was well underway long before the Huangchao rebellion that Tackett and other persistent school scholars attributed the destruction of aristocracy to in the late 9th century, right? So even before their physical destruction, the political advantage of the line itself, of the pedigree itself, had already been in chronic decline, as data clearly shows, right? And the Tang Dynasty became more and more like an ordinary society or normal society where father matters. You know, father matters in all dynasties in China and also in today's China, in today's America, in everywhere in the world, right? Father matters, and education credential increasingly matter in Tang Dynasty. Socially, there seemed to be rising complementarity among aristocracy, meritocracy, and bureaucracy. Okay, that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so thank you very much, Erik. So now let's just welcome Javier to make some comments on Erik's talk. Javier, are you there? Okay, here we go.
Yes, I am here. 1 second. Put the Zoom slide by slide next to my notes. Yes, and I will try not to take too long because I want to leave some time for Q&A for the audience. Not very patient with us. We have 126. It's amazing. First of all, thank you for inviting me to serve as a discussant for this very interesting set of papers that Erik presented. I had a chance to read Erik's PNAS paper when it was first published, and when I was invited to do this, I was very excited because I wanted to have an opportunity to look at his work much more carefully and to hear about get some glimpses of what kind of research he's working on that will be published in the years ahead. It's very exciting. I want to give a set of comments and also raise some questions from the point of view of somebody who it was quite incredible just listening to Erik's presentation, because the topic is, there's so many echoes in the type of research that we do. I work on medieval Korean aristocratic formation, basically the origin of the Yangban society, what we call today Yangban society, and the kind of questions we're trying to pursue, the kind of source materials we're using, and are very, very similar. But I also was kind of struck by how the approaches seem to be quite different. So I wanted to just say a few things and then see how Erik responds, because I think this will be we will result in a very interesting conversation for everyone. One of the first things I wanted to ask Erik is about your characterization of epitaphs as having a survivorship bias, or sources in the Tang Dynasty generally having a survivorship bias, which I would say is a problem for any historical field. And citing Tackett, you mentioned that epitaphs at the same time, among the source materials that we use, we can reliably treat them as a random sample of society, of Tang society. In my approach with medieval Korean history, historical materials, I tend to approach epitaphs as a type of snowball samples. So I don't treat epitaphs as a data sample that is representative of Korea or the early Joseon in the Korean Peninsula, but snowball samples that are found together in bundles, because family members, and including the in-laws family members, And in the case of medieval Korea, you also tend to include maternal grandchildren, and they tend to be discovered together. So I just wanted to say a few, I just wanted to ask Erik to say a few things about how do we know that epitaphs can be treated as a nice random sample of historical Tang China? That would be like every historian's dream to have a random sample of historical population. Speaking of survivorship bias, I do sometimes wear a social scientist hat and pretend to be a social scientist when I use quantitative methods. But generally, I am a historian, very much grounded as a historian. That's what I consider my primary identity to be. So historians would refer to survivorship bias as simply source criticism, right? So from the perspective of a historian engaging in source criticism and not talking about statistical modeling, what do we do with the materiality of those tombstones? Or do we know that Tang tombs were always made of stones? And if they were not made of stones, what do we do with that? How does that affect the survivor, the nature of what kind of materials have survived and have become extant in today, so that we can research the Tang Dynasty? Just wanted also, in talking about the reliability of the data sources that we use, I wanted to also ask Erik to say a few things about, how do we evaluate the reliability of the sources that we use that eventually become part of your wonderful statistical models, which I think give us a very interesting new perspectives on Tang society. And your references to the hometown, the ancestral seats of the prominent officials, to what extent were these fabricated or forged? This was a problem in Korea as well, but it turned out to be not as widespread as people thought at first. So how widespread was it? To what extent can we rely on this information? Was it really possible in a society like the Tang that an official who rose up in ranks, either via patronage or by merit, that they would fabricate their hometown? Or are they attaching themselves into a lineage of a very prominent family? And the next thing I wanted to ask is defining what we mean by an aristocrat as an individual versus an aristocratic family versus a truly prominent families or branches of families that would even appear in the records of left behind by historical actors or in the the emperor's edicts. These are truly like the top 8 surnames from this hometown, this ancestral seat. These are the most prominent families of our empire, versus aristocratic families, as in so aristocrat, as sometimes Erik defines it as from my point of view, listening to your presentation, somebody who rises up and makes it to the upper echelons of the bureaucracy, right? So upper ranking official. Aristocratic family, this is a topic that is heavily debated in Korean historical scholarship as well. It's usually defined as a family or a family branch that manages to produce high-ranking officials for up to about 3 or 4 generations, which is a definition I began to object to in my own research, because one of the things I discovered as I did my research is that aristocratic families that are successful, or families that are successful for 3 or 4 generations and are defined as aristocratic families by the modern scholarship, they do experience turbulence, they do experience purges, they do experience setbacks, and sometimes they do disappear from the historical records. So what do we do with those families that do seem to be extremely powerful for 3 or 4 generations, and then they disappear from the records? Are they still considered aristocrats? Okay, and another, and related to this question of defining what we mean by the aristocracy, and I would suppose, like, if you have a set of a very limited number of aristocratic families that continue to dominate the high-ranking offices, then the society officially does become an oligarchy society. So the distinction between what we mean by an aristocratic versus an oligarchy society, I think, is something that I would like to ask Erik to clarify. Well, did Tang ever become that? I know that medieval Korea did not become an oligarchy society, but I would call it an aristocratic society of a particular kind. And when we define a family as prestigious or prominent, if they are, say, the top 8 surnames of the Tang Dynasty, then they might appear in the records of the records that our historical actors have produced and left behind, and we can consult them. So are they defined a priori by the historical actors, or is this definition being teased out from the data through your analysis? If, for example, you mentioned the inclusion of certain individuals into the giant component that you observe when you engage in a network analysis of the marriage patterns of, say, kinship members that appear in epitaphs. So can we define it in that way? So you have a giant component, and then you have the inclusion of an individual that doesn't seem to belong the giant component, and now are being included, and then successfully generates so the offspring up to 3 or 4, 5 generations continue to dominate in Tang politics. Is there a way of teasing this out? Is your model capturing this at the moment? And the last thing, I don't want to take too much time because I want Erik to clarify some of these issues because I find it really, really interesting. You alluded to several times in your presentation the effects of the Tang as a patronage culture. And I think this is very interesting. This is something that is very central in my own research as well. So one of the things I referenced earlier is this problem that some of these individuals that do successfully produce high-ranking officials for 3 or 4 generations do experience setbacks, and sometimes the setbacks can be quite violent. So they could be purges that really affects the prominence of a family that seem to be very, very powerful, and after one purge is a major setback. They really literally disappear from the records for up to 2 or 3 centuries and might emerge. And the family, when they do make a comeback, they tend to be a branch that is kind of peripheral from the time when the family was, when the clan was very, very prominent in politics. So what do we do with purges? And when we have a patronage culture, how do we measure the effects of a patronage culture? And when you have a high-ranking aristocratic, so-called aristocratic official, offering patronage to somebody who is not so prominent from the patron's point of view, who are these candidates for social mobility? Where do they come from? Are they, obviously they're not poor peasants, like you said. Who are they? How did they get educated? And how do we capture this in quantitatively using your model? And the last thing is the several slides about father effect, which I found really fascinating. But I wonder if there's a need to refine this a little bit, because you referred to father effects, which I find really interesting. But is the father effect capturing the persistence of this aristocratic practice, aristocratic tendencies of the Tang society? Or could the father effect be more likely a sign that a type of patronage culture is still in effect? You know what I mean? Like, if it's persistence of, say, an aristocratic tendency, I think the only way we can measure this is by going as far back as a great-grandfather or great-great-grandmother. The sign that a son is doing really well under the patronage and the protection of the father would actually be a sign that this is still a very predominantly patronage-driven culture, because we're only measuring one generation. And the last thing is coming from medieval Korea. I don't regard the examination system in medieval Korea as a source of meritocracy at all. because the examination system in Korea especially was explicitly defined as a venue for seeking patronage and favors. Literally, the examiner was regarded as your political patron from the time you obtain your degree. You were in fact supposed to go have a banquet with your examiner. That was the custom in the Korean case, and the examiner was regarded as your patron for life. Was this also the case in the Tang? In that case, how should we study this quantitatively? So I will stop here, and yeah, Erik, I look forward to your responses. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much to Javier for the wonderful discussion and for your time. So I'm gonna answer all of your questions, but not necessarily in the order you asked, right? So for father, so there were two questions that I need to share screen. So let me just do that now. Right. So in terms of so one question you asked, this penultimate question you asked is about father effect. So do these father effect mean the persistence of families across generations or some kind of patronage? So actually, this is very interesting, right? So this is, if we really zoom in on the effect of father office rank on son's office rank, Javier, right? So this effect is like less than 0.3. So this is basically means if your father increases the office rank of 1, you will get like a 0.3 boost, right? So that means like across generations, right? Like we also have grandfather effect. So if we actually do the back of envelope calculation, this coefficient is like pretty high. But if you actually do the calculation, this actually indicates that in the Tang elite society, family power does not really persist across many generations, right? Because if you're like if you have one office rank higher than your peers, then you will only give your son like 0.3 boost. Then that 0.3 boost carry into the grandson is going to be multiplied by this coefficient again. Although this is complicated by the grandfather independent effect, but even if we add that, essentially the father and grandfather effect across generations, it doesn't carry very long. Do you see what I mean? So this is really like, so Gary Becker in his classic article called Human Capital and the Rise and Fall of Families actually calculated that with this kind of coefficient, I mean his coefficient is a little smaller than ours because we're talking about medieval elites, right? But with their coefficients, family fortune basically get wiped out within like 3 generations. So here, as I calculated, is roughly like 5 generations. So family power only like persisted across 5 generations, and that's actually consistent with the idea that if you actually look at the genealogies of Tang Dynasty chief minister clans, you usually see like there's like a bunch of like parent, like a great grandpa, grandpa and fathers who were actually not doing very well in bureaucracy, and suddenly this generation there's a guy who became a chief minister, and then that advantage will carry on for like 3 generations, but then the 4th generation, it seems that the office ranks go back to low again, right? So this is really how, using regression models, I cannot directly tell you, Javier, like what what every family is like, but like this coefficient, a moderately big but not too big coefficient, actually will imply that, if you actually multiply through, the Tang elite society is actually very dynamic one. There's no family who can persist so many generations in terms of political success, right? So, and then you asked me about essentially the effect of family background on career, on examination success, right? Because in Korea, in Chosun Dynasty, of course, as you said, there are anecdotes about people courting favors with the examiner, and meaning that basically people who already have good family background could succeed more likely in exams. And in Tang Dynasty, there are those anecdotes as well, but there are also policies, especially affirmative action policies, against people who come from good families. Especially in the 9th century, there were a lot of court debate and court policies, emperors specifically taking actions against certain elite families by really just making it very, very hard for their sons to obtain examination credential, and it actually became a heated topic in late Tang factional politics. Of course, I'm not really overstating. I'm not trying to overstate these policies, right? Because after all, if you go against the most powerful families, the policy shouldn't be expected to have extreme success, right? But in terms of the data, right? If we look at the data, we see that prominent branch doesn't give you a boost in passing exam. Effect of father's rank doesn't give you one measure continuously, right? So I'm going to talk about this a little later. So in general, it's not like your father's rank will increase your probability of passing the exam, grandpa the same. And this is Takis' definition of aristocracy in terms of elite marriage networks. As I said, this is endogenous because those who pass the Keju could join the elite marriage networks. So towards the end of the Tang, it seems that if you come from this elite marriage networks, you're more likely to pass the Keju, although the statistics are, the estimates are not very precise. And as I said, this might have something to do with the fact that in Takis' definition, those who pass the Keju, those lowborn who pass the Keju, who marry into the networks, will be regarded as part of the networks. Okay, so regarding father's rank, this is really sort of, we regress passing the exam on a continuous variable from 0 to 18.75, which is a numeric conversion of the Chinese ranks, right? But if we actually recategorize this variable, we're gonna separate this father rank variable into very high rank father, fairly high rank father, mediumly rank father, and low rank father. And the comparison group is that you do not have a father in office, right? We see that for those who come from the very, very powerful families, right? Like a father with rank 3 and above, in the 9th century, there seemed to be an increase in those people's chance of getting examination, like passing the Keju exam, even though here the estimate is a little imprecise. But for those with like mediumly powerful families, that do not seem to affect at least it's not consistent that it always affected examination success. So yes, family background did play a role, especially but mostly for people who came from very, very powerful families. And this trend, Javier, actually is consistent with what I said earlier, which is that in the 9th century, actually the Tang emperors try to impose some affirmative actions against the offspring of high-ranking officials, right? So probably because of this, right, they were trying to curb the influence. But ultimately, when we talk about social mobility, right, we want to talk about, even though family background matters, especially for those from the top of the top, for in terms of passing the Keju exam. That's why it's important to have all of these things controlled for in the regression, right? So even controlling for everything, there's still an independent effect of Keju, and that's just going up and up and up over time, and it's non-stoppable, right? And also here, if there is an equalizing effect of Keju potential, right? So this is basically conditional on passing the Keju, right? So this is not saying that father doesn't affect your chance of passing the Keju, right? But this is saying that if you pass the Keju, right, for whatever reason, once you pass it, then your career trajectory is just it's basically your own doing. Family background no longer matter anymore, right? So let me stop sharing and let's talk about some other questions that you raised, right? So one question you raised is the sample of
sorry, Erik.
Yeah.
Maybe we can just quickly go through the rest of the comments because we still have some questions in the Q&A, and I think Zhu also want you to say something. So if we can just quickly go through the rest of the response, then we still have we can go through all of it.
Yeah. I will go through them because some of them are actually important. So I will make sure to be quick. So don't worry. So Javier talked about the sampling of epitaphs, right? So whether it's a random sample. So I'm not claiming that it's a completely random sample. I claim that it's a roughly random sample of elite society, right? So those who can read and write and are financially affluent enough to afford epitaphs. So those are basically the socio-political economic elite. So for those, and it's particularly for those who were in northern China that this practice is much more prevalent initially in the town than southern China. But in southern China, the practice later picked up, right? So that's why in my regression models, I control for modern province fixed effects, right? And then Javier also asked, are these materials always stones, right? So that's interesting because in southern China, especially in the Yangtze Delta, the material is like in the later half of the Tang Dynasty, the materials were stones, but earlier on, the material were bricks. So bricks, like 砖, not stone. Stone is 石, right? Bricks is 砖. So brick is so on the bricks, you cannot write very detailed stuff. You cannot write very long essays on the bricks. So there is some kind of difference in materials. So in the appendix of the PNAS article, we actually did a lot of reweighting to reweight even either for the Yangtze Delta or against the Yangtze Delta, and the results are consistent. So when it comes to definition of aristocracy, so this is a question that you can actually circumvent with regression models, because here, what I'm interested in is really the effect of family background on career outcomes, right? So I measure different dimensions of family background. One is pedigree, one is power, right? And I see how these variables affect career outcomes, right? So this is different. This is slightly different by saying, an like what is exactly an aristocrat? I just basically separate out the dimensions of family background and check their effects. Okay, so I also want to talk about the fabrication of chrononyms in the town. So it is very prevalent. It is not I have not quantified the extent of fabrication. You could do it very easily, right? So one way to do it is to really use demography, right? So for example, there's a famous Chinese poet called Han Yu, right? Han Yu essentially said his 7th generation grandfather is somebody who is from a very, very far away, right? Like a millennium ago, right? And that's just not true, right? Because that will assume that every generation could only give birth to a son when the guy turned like 60 or 50 year old, right? Basically, it's inconsistent with basic demographic principles, right? So that's one way you can quantify the extent of fabrication. But like a lot of anecdotes suggest very high prevalent fabrication. So for example, as some of the people here may know, there are 2 prominent clans with surname Wang. One is the Wang of Taiyuan, and one is the Wang of Langya, right? So in 8th century, there is actually a Wang of Taiyuan who did some research. So in 8th century, he did research on genealogy, and then he lamented that there are so many other members of his clan fabricated to be one of Langya, right? So this basically means that even quote unquote real aristocrats already forgot about their true ancestors. And then because they their family success in recent history was so bad, right? They believe themselves to be from a humble background, and then they want to actually adopt a coronym to pretend to be aristocrat. So they so because their surname is Wang, they adopted another famous coronym, right? So this shows that even like the so-called aristocrats themselves, because of the dramatic social mobility, a lot of them, you know, went downward, and then they didn't believe that they were born not knowing that they were actually having this, they actually had this prominent ancestor, and then they adopted another ancestor by fabricating coronym, right? So there's no oligarchy in the Tang. Even though a lot of top officials do claim from aristocratic clans, as I said, because of demographic expansion, this group is really diluted, right? It's not like, so for example, if it's really like if I go back to my hometown and then there's someone whose name is Wang, and he claimed to have this ancestor, I claim to have this ancestor, but we don't know each other for like several generations. Like, what does this even mean, right? It doesn't mean anything, right? And then if we look at Tang history, you know, the power of the emperor is not as big as in the Song dynasty later on, but it's definitely much bigger. Emperor in Tang is very powerful, much more powerful than previous dynasties. And the turnover rate of chief ministers is very high. And there are a lot of chief ministers present at any moment, right? So there's a lot of turnover, a lot of families join, and new families always join. And then sometimes they will adopt a coronym. So it's a very dynamic political arena and elite society. So this is just sort of my short responses, and I'm really grateful to Javier, because I read your work, Javier, on sort of if you look at specific families, their fortunes actually fall, right? Like I read your work, and then when Professor Chen thankfully invited me for this, I just nominated. I said, please bring me Javier Cha, right? So thank you so much, and let's open the floor to questions.
All right, thank you, Eric. And since we're on quite a little bit, so I think we probably don't have time for the Q&A part, but I will just let Zhiwu to draw some final remarks, and I will make sure all the questions, especially the two question from Lawrence Zhang and Wenyi Xiang to you later on in the email. But yeah, Zhiwu, you can just really draw a conclusion remark.
Yeah, thank you, Zhang. Eric, thank you very much. Very good, very great presentation, especially on the background of this whole literature on the medieval Chinese aristocracy. I just have one very quick comment. You know, maybe one question. You know, what are the drivers for this change? You know, if there was a decline of the importance of aristocracy during the Tang Dynasty period, especially even before the Huangchao rebellion. So I wonder whether you have actually done a lot of work on the drivers of such a change. I mean, for that matter, my speculative conjecture is that so maybe you know, it was just part of the transition from the dominance by northern China to you know, the south, so that Southerners gradually became more and more important in not just the economic space, but also in the political space of the Tang Dynasty. So maybe the geographical distribution of the epitaphs in your sample was also is also gradually shifting from the north gradually to the south. And then for Southerners, they did not really have a lot of long tradition or long aristocratic background because to begin with, right, there were not many Southerners playing any big role in the early Tang Dynasty or prior to the Tang Dynasty. So there was not that much ancestral history to rely on to get promotions. But as the shift was going on from the north to the south, then you would have this declining importance of ancestral background, because anyway, the Southerners did not have much to rely on to begin with. Okay. Anyway, just because we're out of time, so let me just stop here.
Sorry. Let me. I just thought that we have until 11 a.m. right?
No.
No, it's 10:30.
Oh, okay. So let me, because I do want to address one of a very important questions by Lawrence Zhang in the Q&A, but let me respond to Professor Zhu's question first, right? So this is, yeah, it's important, right? So there are many drivers of this change. So one of them is just that, you know, the nature of the bureaucratic competition is very high, and then there are sort of moderate expansion of education, right? So like once you have Keju set up, right? Initially, a lot of chief ministers, like you get like overall increase in the proportion of chief ministers who are from Keju credential. And then when the society see that, they see that, oh, so because the society doesn't do any regressions, right? Like they just see, oh, there are a lot of, you know, chief ministers who are from Keju credential. Then let's also compete in this Keju, right? So this basically, there's a permeation of such a culture, and that also leads to further investment in human capital. And in the, as Professor Chen highlighted, in the Yangtze Delta, yes, initially in early Tang, they were not great, right? They didn't perform well, but then there are a lot of families, right? You know, like that. For example, the most prominent one is the Gui family. The Gui family, like they were like Zhuangyuan, like the ranked first for like 3 generations, right? So in late Tang. Sorry, but let me okay, so you don't have enough time.
No,
So
yeah, we really have to finish the debate by now.
Right. So basically, so I want to quickly answer Lawrence Zhang's question. So I control for, so like if you actually look at TACI, so Lawrence Zhang believed that the TACI uses a broader definition. What I'm saying is that my measure is correlated with his definition, right? So that passed the validation check. And then if you actually just regress career outcomes on TACI's definition of aristocracy using TACI's own epitaphic data, that variable actually didn't have any significant influence on career outcomes. So basically using TACI's own definition on his own epitaphic data, there's actually no significant effect of his definition for aristocracy, even though it's already endogenous, right, on career outcomes, right? And then, yeah, so okay, so we can adjourn, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Erik. So lastly, just let me quickly show you a quick announcement to our next event. Yeah, here we go. So for the next talk, we'll have Professor Li Nan from Fudan University to discuss this topic: how did China become a country dominated by the Han ethnicity? So yeah, and if you are interested in the topic, please do make sure you join us on the 4th of July. And yeah, thank you again, Erik, for this interesting topic, and also thanks Javier for this really interactive conversations, and also Zhu for his comments. I will make sure all the questions from Lawrence, from who that one, Wen Yi and Xiaoyang and Haipen will be delivered to Erik afterwards with your contacts with them, so that Erik will be able to reply your questions in email. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.